Now is a great time to talk about one of Bubble's newest and most exciting functionalities, which is called the Responsive Page Builder, which really just makes responsive pages. But what exactly is responsive? To explain it best, let's talk about what we're doing today in Bubble when we take an element over here and put it over here. This is called a fixed positioning layout, which means when you take a text element and drag it here, you're telling Bubble that this is exactly where this element sits on the screen. And this is really great for the majority of use cases on the web. When we hit preview in our app today, we see, okay, the text element shows up exactly where we like it, and these input fields here work as well. But when we go ahead and actually shrink the screen here, we can see that at a certain point, our elements get cut off and they don't move. And this is one of the downsides to fixed positioning, is that it's not responsive. It doesn't adjust to our browser's size. And you'll see here that we kind of fake some responsiveness with a centered page element, but for anyone viewing on a phone, for example, we can really just imagine the experience is going to be pretty terrible. And responsive is usually a really tough thing to do because it's a lot more complicated than just dragging and dropping. And so Bubble has solved this problem by coming up with a really ingenious page builder. And it's really a responsive engine that's designed around a few basic facts. So the first fact is, when you drag and drop, you're telling Bubble some information, like, hey, I want this element to be really on this page. But with the responsive engine, you are now telling Bubble, hey, I want this element to be around here. And the algorithm inside their engine is now going to say, hey, when the page breaks and the size of the screen is either mobile or a tablet, we're going to try to do different things to still display this information to the user. So let's dig into exactly what the responsive engine looks like and really what the major differences are. And, besides actually going through this page, another thing that's really helpful to have open is the documentation tab inside of Bubble. And if you go to the home page, click on documentation, and then navigate over to user manual, this is a new chapter called Chapter 3, which is building responsive pages. And so there's a lot of good things here, especially the rules. These key concepts, which we're going to go over in some depth, are really the heart of what makes this responsive engine work. Okay, so let's first go ahead and turn on the responsive engine. And there are actually two ways that this is going to happen. If you've been using Bubble for a while, at least a couple months, then this is something that you'll have to actually turn on in older applications. All new applications are actually going to have Bubble's responsive engine turned on by default. But because we've built this application before, we're going to need to turn on the new responsive page engine inside of the index tab. So right now we're on the home page, and we can go ahead and first click this. And one thing you'll notice right away is that that changes our background entirely. And so we're actually going to need to go back and remove this stripe element, because stripe was a feature that really it kind of mimicked responsiveness in one way, because the stripe didn't move across the page and it was able to be fully responsive. And so we can actually remove the stripe because it's no longer supported in the responsive engine. Okay, so now we go back and we hit Enable Page Engine, and this is going to change our page layout. And the first thing you'll notice is that our elements that are white are going to look like they're hidden. So let's go ahead and enable this grid functionality, because boxes and grids are really going to come in handy when it comes to actually understanding how this layout works. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do to understand this is replace the background that we had here with an image group or an image element. So we're going to first create a group here, and we are going to drag it across the page, and we're going to double click this group. We're going to click image. And just as we did with our last homepage, we're going to go and search for free images, and we're going to type in house. And we want one with a nice dark background, so how about this one right here? All right, so we'll hit import, and that will pull that in from that source. And once it's in there, we're going to want to right click and then click Send to Back. And then with these elements, you want to just hover over them, make sure to click them, move them a little bit, and that will make sure they're actually inside of this group element that we've created. Okay, so now that we have this image element inside, and we can see if we check the header element here, now we have some basic elements to play around with the responsive functionality. We have the text element here, we have the header, and we have a few input fields and a button. And let's see what happens when we go ahead and hit preview and see how this changes. Whoa. So automatically you'll notice it looks pretty different. And let's explain a little bit about what's going on here. So with the responsive editor, Bubble is now guessing really where we want different elements to be displayed based on how big our browser is. So you'll notice the first difference here when I drag and move my window around, now stuff actually starts to move, which is completely opposite from fixed positioning, which is what we were using before. And so the way that I really like to think about the Bubble responsive engine is that before in fixed positioning, you're telling Bubble, hey, this is where I want this element, and that's it. And with the responsive engine, instead, Bubble's taking their best guess, and you're actually now working backwards, saying, hey, you guessed this part right, but this part I need to tweak a little bit. And to understand what's actually happening on this page, we want to actually click on this new inspector area here, which is called responsive. And one of the reasons why we enabled boxes before is because now we can see how these elements work. So for example, this border here is what is now causing our welcome home text element when the screen reaches a certain size to drop to the next line, which is basically called a break in responsive design. And so really the best way to go about fixing some of the quirks now, because for example, if I shrink this down, I can't read this, my login functionality is gone. So what we want to do is we want to work step by step and get our responsive engine in tune so that our page ends up looking really good no matter what type of device is accessing it. And the way that I really like to approach this is by working right to left. So for example, as we take the screen here and we shrink it, what starts to happen first? Okay, so the first thing we notice is this text element. So let's go ahead and work on this. So let's go ahead and go back into the editor here, and you can widen your page. And we're going to take a look at exactly what options we have to fix this page element display. So when we click into the inspector here, we see some new options. And these are the options that allow us to override some of the automatic assumptions that the algorithm is making. So the first is make this element fixed width. And that is basically going to say, hey, no matter what happens with page size, don't change the width of this element. The next option is minimum width, which is, hey, if we shrink this past a certain point and the screen gets really small, make sure that we're at least displaying this much width for the actual thing. And apply a max width when page is stretched is basically saying, hey, when the page is really big, don't stretch this out so far that either the image becomes distorted or the field becomes too big. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can figure out the right one to fix this from breaking on a line and becoming unreadable. And with the responsive engine in general, you can make edits directly to the elements here, and then you can click up right above the page menu here and then click into responsive viewer. And responsive viewer is really Bubble's way of previewing what the responsive changes are going to do based on a different screen size. And here's just a brief intro to how this works. You have these different options here, so we can click what it would look like on a laptop, tablet, landscape phone, portrait phone. You can also drag and drop what the screen size is going to be, so you can actually see how the changes happen as you drag things. You can also add in different elements here. So these are reusable elements that we're using right now. You can click on these different elements to make some adjustments, which we're going to do in just a moment. And you can also click up here to bring that same inspector element from the debugger into this page as well, just to see exactly where the different lines are and how the breaks are incorporated here. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about how this works, let's go back to the welcome home area. So we see here that the current minimum width is 30%, and as we drag the screen, we can see that it is dragging welcome home to the next line. And that's making it look a little bit off center. And that is also affecting how it's positioned on the page, because right now it's saying, hey, this is 30%, but the text is going over the actual page itself. So let's fix this right now. We can see here that there's a little bit of extra room in the box. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do is click Edit Text Welcome Home. And that will take us back into building mode where we can center this element. So now that we've centered this element, we can go back to the responsive viewer. And let's see what happens when we check fixed width, because this is what we really want. We want this to always stay on one line, because even when it's a phone, you can still see this whole text. And this is going to make it look a lot nicer. Okay, so we just made that one change, but let's just go ahead and see how this has affected our page when we go into the responsive viewer. All right. So this has really fixed it. Now we have welcome home, which is in the middle of our screen, and we can go ahead and shrink the page all the way down, and we can still see welcome home clearly, and it's always going to be centered. Awesome. So this is the best way to learn the responsive builder, is by trial and error, because you really need to make these tweaks in order to learn how the system works. And we will start to incorporate more of these elements of responsiveness into our actual designing. But the beauty of Bubble is that you can really click and drag first without really worrying about how the responsive engine is going to work. And then later you can come back and say, oh, this is how I need to optimize for mobile and tablet. So with the same process that we were using, which is right to left, we're now going to shrink again, and we're going to see, all right, what is the next thing that happens? And it seems that the next thing we need to take care of is our Signup button, which starts to disappear. So this is something interesting, because this is actually a reusable element. And because of that, we will need to go to the reusable element page, which is this header here. And we will need to do a very similar process, which is clicking on header and enabling the new page engine. And we're now going to want to affect the actual responsiveness of the header itself before going back to the index page. So we can click here and see, just by default, we only have 3 elements here, so it should be pretty simple. How are these elements going to work together? So we have, okay, desktop view or laptop view, which looks fine. Tablet view looks a little weird. We're going to have to fix that. And now it looks like when we go to landscape view, our buttons are kind of dropping over here. So let's drag this back out and let's fix a few things. So the first is, when we get down to around here, our logo area is kind of messing up. So let's go ahead and change that. We can change the minimum width to, let's say, 60%. And let's see how that affects exactly what happens here. Okay, so it still looks like we're getting some drop off, but it's not that bad. Let's see what happens when we click on fixed width. Okay, so now it looks like we have the Airbed and Breakfast logo that is solid, but now it's going to force these elements down a little bit prematurely. So you can see here our Signup button is all of a sudden dropping, and this is kind of weird. Whenever you see a page break that you don't understand, you can click on the element itself and then click on Explain Box Margins over here. And that's going to tell you exactly how this broke down. So for example, the top margin is a result of this text element. The left margin comes from this left margin here, and the right margin comes from the sign up button. And really this is just telling you, hey, this is what the original margin was, and this is how our algorithm is processing it based on the size of the screen. And whenever you see a margin that is kind of off, there's one way that you can actually make it kind of go away and have the lines actually just work in a better way. And that's by grouping elements together. So if we hold the Shift button down and we click Sign Up, Login, and our text element here, and then we right-click and click on Group Elements into a group. Now, because we've grouped these elements, we can make a few adjustments. The first, when we click on the group itself, is that we want to change the maximum width when this is stretched. And we want to keep this at 100%. 150 would mean it would basically get a little bit wider. You can really test this out, but what we are basically saying here is when the page continues to get stretched out farther, don't stretch out this element. The other thing that we can do is we can say that we want a certain minimum width here, which right now is 30%. So let's see, with just making that one tweak, how this affects how the page breaks down. So we can see here that the element does not get wider, it just moves when the page is now bigger than 980, which is 115%. You can see that right over here. When we go to tablet, now we can see, okay, the buttons are still doing this kind of weird thing here, but they now break up, and now our logo at least looks a little bit better on the mobile and landscape view. So now that we have a good idea of what this looks like, now we can actually click on these elements and we can tell them where they should go on the page. So we always want our logo to be on the left side, so we will click left alignment. And our buttons, we always want on the right. So we will click right here and then right here. We also want these buttons to be fixed width, because when they shrink, they all of a sudden lose a lot of their power. And especially on a mobile device, it's really tough to actually press a very small button. So let's go ahead, and now that we've aligned these elements a little bit differently, let's see how they work. Okay, so it looks like we have at our laptop view, looks normal. Our tablet view, okay, looks better, but our buttons are now stacking, which is good to know. And then it looks like that's exactly the same thing that happens with our landscape view and our portrait view. Okay, so we can test this out, seeing how as the page shrinks, we now have these two buttons that are stacking, but this is at least a step in the right direction. And if we go back to preview our app and click on refresh, we can see this in action. Okay, so look at our login and sign up button. And as we get here, instead of leaving the page, they now just stack. And as we get smaller and smaller, our buttons still remain. That's great. If we wanted to take this a step further and make our buttons not stack, we could use the same group trick that we did before. So let's go back to building mode. Let's click on Login, hold the Shift button, and then click on Sign Up. Let's right-click now, and now group elements into a group. Now let's make this element fixed width. Let's see now if we go back to Responsive Viewer, how this affects it. Okay, so now our buttons do not stack each other, they just kind of slide. And let's now test out on laptop. That looks great. Tablet looks great as well. On landscape, great. And mobile, it looks all right. So it looks like right here we have some overlapping elements just because of our fixed width positioning. And if we took fixed width off here and took it down to, let's say, 51 or looks like 52% here, or 53, now it looks like we have the ability to display all of these on one line. And although this is breaking our logo up a bit, because it's text, if you had a photo here or an image, this would probably look a little bit more natural. So let's take a look at exactly what we have going now. You'll see here as our page shrinks, it's bringing breakfast in our logo to the next line. That actually doesn't look too bad. And now we're keeping the login buttons at the same area. Awesome. So you really get a sense for how this responsive engine works. Let's click on it right here so we can see. So the responsive engine is essentially just something you need to play around with a lot to learn how it works, because it does have a little bit of a learning curve, but it's a lot easier when you actually realize how complex this is. It's better than having to say, hey, at this width do this, at this width do this, which is what a lot of other frameworks have to do. And this is still allowing you kind of the magic of Bubble, which is dragging and dropping. All right, so we have the sign up area complete, and we now can move on to the final elements, which are the input fields here and the button. So as we shrink, everything's actually looking pretty good up until around, I want to say around this point, which is first you'll see that the text starts to get cut off in our first input, which is location. And also, now our boxes are pretty small. So on mobile, you can imagine this is going to be kind of a headache, because you'll have to type into this box, you'll have to click the tiny search box, and really the behavior that you see with most mobile sites is that these will actually stack. So let's go back into Bubble and see how we can go and change that. We're going to want to click on the Index tab to take us back here. And the first thing that we'll want to do is work on these input fields and exactly their max and min widths. Because, for example, these fields are huge right now. There's all this white space that we don't need. So when we go back to click on this first input area here, we can now use these different fields. Minimum width, 30%. Apply a max width when the page is stretched. Let's change this from 150 to 100. Same with check-in. We'll change that from 150 to 100. And checkout, 150 to 100. And now let's see how that's affected the page. We go to Responsive Viewer and click on Desktop. Okay, so these fields are now not as large, but they're kind of spaced out, and it just looks a little bit weird. And as we drag it, we see, okay, we are still getting this clip off here. And we're going to want to adjust the minimum now. So we'll click on this first element here. Current minimum width is 30%. So let's bump it up to 46. Okay, so that has now enabled this. It's also done some wacky stuff, but it's enabled us to keep the full placeholder text in here, which is awesome. And now we can go back, drag this out, and just see how this is now forcing the where do you want to go field to have a minimum width of 46%. With check-in, 30% is going to be fine. Same with checkout. Okay, that's great. So you notice something weird. So as soon as we got to a certain point, now that we have these elements starting to push others to the next line, that is creating kind of this big gap here. And as I explained before, the best way whenever you see kind of something you don't understand is to explain the box margins. And what it's telling us here is that the top margin is coming from this input field, and the left margin is coming from the same input field. So we're going to want to do the same trick that we did with the header element, which is grouping these elements together. So hold Shift down, right click, group elements into a group. This also has a pretty big advantage because when we actually right-click now, we can hit center, make this look a little bit nicer. And we can also, now that these elements are grouped together, we can specify a max width when the page is stretched. So we're going to click on this button and we're going to keep it 100%. And the reason why that's great is that now when we refresh the page, we'll see that it actually stays centered, and it allows us, when the page is stretched, to just make sure that the elements don't move. It gives us a nice margin on both sides. Okay, let's see how that affected the responsiveness. We'll go back to the responsive viewer. Let's click on desktop and start from there and move down. Okay, so right now on desktop, looks great. Tablet, looks fine. Landscape, great. And okay, not that bad. So we have, it looks like this is getting still pushed to the next line, but at least the margin isn't as crazy because the elements are grouped together. And now we can work on actually making this look a little bit nicer and keeping the check-in field and check-out field from being really tiny and kind of bunched up on the same line. So we'll click on check-in here. And let's change the minimum width. We'll drag it in, and we will say 63%. Checkout. Let's do the same. And now it seems that we have check-in and checkout both now sharing a line with the search button underneath it. And now let's see how that affects the page. So as we drag out, it looks great. So now this is awesome. Let's shrink it a bit. And right around here, we'll see that it will push the search button now to its own line. And then this is where now check-in forces check-out to the next line. And now you see we're going to shrink where do you want to go until it gets to its minimum, and then it's going to push check-in to check-out at the exact page. And so when you have multiple elements like this, you're going to want to really play around and make a lot of different tweaks. So for example, if we want check-in and check-out to move together, we're going to have to group them together on another level. So we'll hold Shift, we'll click Group Elements into a group, and then let's see what happens when we make this fixed width. We'll go back to responsive. Now we'll click on desktop. Looks great. Tablet. Looks good. Looks good here. And there we go. So now that we've done that, these elements are now going to move together. So you're not going to get that awkward thing we had before where the checkout input is on the next line. And as we shrink the screen and go to the smallest mode, which is viewing it on an iPhone or Android, we can see here we have where you want to go, check in, check out, and the search button. And you'll notice that these are kind of bunched up here. And one of the ways that we can fix this is by going back to building mode here. And now we can see, well, why are those elements getting bunched up? And it's because there's actually no margin on the top of this group. So if we click on the group itself and give it some margin on the top by dragging this up a bit, and some margin on the bottom by dragging this down a bit, that is now going to tell Bubble's responsive engine, hey, give some margin in between because this is what the original margin is. So now let's go back to the responsive viewer. And just like that, we have a really great input area. So let's just double test this one more time. And we see here, okay, we have a responsive page. And when we drag it right here, it looks great. When we drag it here, we now see everything drops to the next line. And finally, we get to the mobile view. And this is really the process you'll need to go through for every element that you want to make responsive, or every page that you need to be responsive. And as you've kind of seen here, it's not really the toughest thing in the world. You just need to get the hang of it, and then you'll know that with a couple of these tricks, like grouping things together, you'll be able to make all of this work. And the other exciting thing is that you can always view how these changes are being made with the responsive engine turned on the debugging layer. And that is really a great learning tool in itself, because as we saw almost accidentally last time, when we click on something, a pop-up will appear and it will show you kind of what the algorithm is thinking. So hey, these elements all stretch and move together. This text, welcome home. This box is hidden, shown based on element text, welcome home, which has the following visibility rule, always show. Awesome. If we click down here, we can see, hey, here's group A, header logged in. We click down here, we can see group B, which is what contains all of the input elements. So that's really just how we can think about Bubble's responsive viewer going forward. This is going to really empower you to make awesome apps that look great on mobile, tablet, and desktop. And we're going to incorporate this later on in the course with the rest of our pages, including the search page, the listing page, the user profile, etc. But the best part about the responsive engine is that you can always come back and make your pages responsive, and we'll focus first on what makes it so amazing in the first place, which is just dragging and dropping.